The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. This week the Jews observed Tisha B'av, which is their annual fast commemorating the destruction of the first and second temples. Now the question Jews ask during this solemn observance is, how could this have happened to Jerusalem? They read from the book of Lamentations, which starts with the Hebrew word icha, meaning how. That's the first word that you'll read in Lamentations 1:1. How could God have allowed these terrible tragedies to happen in this city, Jerusalem, the city God Himself established and set apart? Let's notice that verse over in Lamentations. Lamentations chapter 1 here in verse 1. Here's how the book begins. It says, how, that's that Hebrew word icha, how does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces, how is she become tributary? How could Jerusalem be laid waste, they wonder? Why did God allow the first and second temples to be destroyed? Of course, the answer to that comes from Israel's own history. It's right in the Hebrew Bible. When the Israelites arrived in the Promised Land way back under the leadership of Joshua, they were united together as one nation under God. And moving on quickly through that history, Israel, of course, reached its apex of power during the reigns of King David and his son Solomon. But because of Solomon's sexual sins and his idol worship, God split the kingdom in half, just as He had prophesied. The northern 10 tribes made Samaria their capital, and they retained the name Israel, those 10 tribes, and then the smaller southern kingdom maintained this city, Jerusalem, as its capital, and then became known as the Kingdom of Judah. And from the point of that division forward, the Bible then deals with Israel and Judah as two separate nations. They dwelt in separate yet adjoining regions. Each of them had different kings. They even fought against one another at times. You can see that in 1 Kings 14. Now the first king of the northern kingdom, or the northern tribes, was Jeroboam. And he rejected God's holy days and introduced idol worship right away and spread it all across his nation. And that rebellious spirit continued for many generations, despite the earnest pleadings and warnings from God's prophets, urging the Israelites to return to God in humble obedience. But because the people of Israel refused to heed those warnings, God said, just as He had prophesied, that He would uproot them right out of their land and scatter them abroad over the face of the earth. That's in 1 Kings 14 and verse 15. Now, God, of course, and you can study a lot of this even in secular history, God used the Assyrian Empire as His rod of correction. You can read more on that in 2 Kings 15 through 17. The Assyrians took them into captivity. Now, the kingdom of Judah continued on for more than a century after Israel was taken into captivity, but they too rebelled against God and His laws. The Bible talks about that in great detail, and in fact corrects Judah for not learning the lesson of her sister in Israel. In 2 Kings 23 and verse 27, God warned Judah. He said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and will cast off this city, Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So God used, in this case, the Babylonians, that great empire under King Nebuchadnezzar, to correct the nation of Judah. The Babylonians came in here, they ransacked the city of Jerusalem. It continued, the siege did, for almost 2 decades. And eventually they just utterly destroyed the temple that Solomon had built. And God then removed the Jews from Palestine, just as He had done with the Israelites 130 years earlier. Now, moving forward in the history, at least with the kingdom of Judah, 70 years after the destruction of Solomon's temple and the start of Judah's captivity, God inspired the Persian king, Cyrus, to send a small band of Jews back to Jerusalem out of captivity, about 50,000 of them. and he sent them back to rebuild the temple, to build the second temple. These Israelitish people, they all came from that small southern nation of Judah. You can see that clearly in the book of Ezra, Ezra 1 and 2, those first two chapters. They all came from the tribe of Judah. Now the northern 10 tribes, meanwhile, had been scattered all across the northern regions above here and on into Europe eventually, and they were lost from world view. They never did return to Palestine. They became known as the lost 10 tribes, in fact. Even in the Gospels, Jesus referred to them as being lost from world view. He knew where they were, but they were lost from world view. They even lost their own identity. They lost their Hebrew language, their customs, their culture, their traditions, even, as I say, their own identity when they went into captivity. And they just absorbed the influences around them. But now here in this region, under the leadership of men like Zerubbabel and others like Ezra and Nehemiah, those Jewish captives rebuilt the second temple, or the temple that was called the second temple. They reconstructed much of this ruined city behind me that was ransacked and overrun by so many warring nations. They rebuilt it. Nehemiah, of course, constructed the wall around Jerusalem. And this Jewish revival, it repositioned the Jewish state right back toward the center of the world stage. But of course, not long after the Jews completed work on rebuilding the temple, they again rebelled against God and His laws. They disregarded the warnings from His prophets. He sent them all kinds of prophets during that time as well. They are called the minor prophets today. God sent these minor prophets, as they're called, to warn the Jewish people of their impending captivity for failing to repent, for failing to turn to God. Haggai and Zechariah, for example, they came and delivered their warning messages to the Jews while the temple was being constructed. And then God sent along the prophet Malachi later, even after the construction was done. And these warnings, as I say, they just continued. Now, by the time Jesus Christ came along in the first century, the second temple, of course, was still standing, although it had been remodeled and enlarged by Herod the Great. But the Jewish religion, by that point, had evolved into something very different than what God had established through Moses 1,500 years earlier. In the gospel accounts, there's numerous confrontations recorded there between Christ and the Jewish leaders of His day. Let's just notice one of those confrontations over in Matthew chapter 23, the Gospel of Matthew. Here in this particular passage, Jesus says the Pharisees, or compared them to whitewashed tombs, because they were so concerned about their outward appearance, their righteousness on the outside, quote unquote, you could say, when on the inside they were filled with corruption and decay. And of course Christ pointed that out, and they didn't like it. In verse 31, Jesus said that they were the children of those who killed the prophets, actually. Not only were the warnings of the prophets generally ignored, these prophets of God were persecuted, oftentimes driven into exile, sometimes even killed, as Jesus pointed out. Now notice verses 36 through 37 in particular. This is Christ, He's speaking. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets and stone them which are sent unto you, how often," He says, "would I have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not." Now, of course, this warning message is really for all of mankind today, for all of the descendants of Israel, not just the Jews alone. God, it says here, would have gathered Israel and Judah anciently, instead of sending them into captivity with Assyria or Babylon. Had they just heeded the warnings that came from the prophets, had they returned to God, had they started obeying God's laws, He would have gathered in those who came along later and reestablished a Jewish vassal state during the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. If they only would have heeded God's prophetic warnings, He would have spared Jerusalem and the temple from total destruction. That's what Christ is saying here. Now, if you continue reading into Matthew 24, read those first few verses there. Jesus continues by pointing to the temple. He was over on the Mount of Olives, just back here behind me to the left. And he was talking to his disciples, and he pointed to the temple, and he pointed to all the buildings surrounding the temple, the structures around them. And he told his disciples in verse 2, "There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, this prophecy, of course, was fulfilled in 70 AD. This was the second destruction that the Jews commemorate on this annual fast. It happened in 70 AD when the great Roman army swept through here under the direction of Titus and invaded the Jews' beloved city, totally destroying the Second Temple. Now, the Jewish historian Josephus actually witnessed much of this siege and lived to write about it in one of his books. He said Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and temple. It was so thoroughly, notice this, it was so thoroughly laid, even with the ground, by those that dug it up to the foundation, that there was left nothing to make those that came there believe it had ever been inhabited. That's how total the destruction was, just as Jesus had prophesied. Josephus continues, "This was the end which Jerusalem came to, a city otherwise of great magnificence and of mighty fame among all mankind." Now, how could this have happened? That's what many will ask on this Jewish annual observance, Tisha B'av. How could this happen? As if there's no definitive reason why. But there is a reason. It's right here in the Hebrew Bible, as I said. It happened because of rampant lawlessness and rebellion. That's why. It happened because of sin. Now, that's the lesson we'll learn if we'll actually dig into and study God's Word. But here in Israel, there have been studies that have shown only 16% of the Jews say they even read the Hebrew Bible. 16%. Think about that. Most people think of Israel as this very religious state. You see the Jews, they look religious, many of them. But yet only 16% even read the Hebrew Bible. Now think about that. It's probably the same in every other nation. How are we ever going to learn the lesson of history if we don't even know our history? How could these terrible tragedies have happened in the Jerusalem of old? Well, God tells us how, if we'll just listen to what He says. In fact, God tells us it's going to happen again if we fail to learn the lesson of our own history. Go back and reread Jerusalem in Prophecy if you haven't read it for a while. It's a great little booklet that we provide for free that tells you what lies ahead for this very city of Jerusalem. History is repeating itself. But as that booklet brings out, there is hope for this city. There is hope for Jerusalem, a city that has seen so much violence and bloodshed down through the centuries. There's plenty of hope. And here again, it's contained in the precious words that God has preserved in His Holy Scriptures. Request Jerusalem in Prophecy, and we'll make sure to send you out a free copy right away. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.